Hello, good evening, good morning, or good afternoon. Wherever you are in the world, welcome to the University of Glasgow and the European Association of Work and Organisational Psychology's webinar on human psychology. We thank you for choosing to spend some time with us. So wherever you are, we hope that you're okay. As far as we're concerned, you're most welcome. My name is Rosalind Searle, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour and a half. As we've seen today, and in our news screens, human security is sadly a very hot topic. Whether you're in Syria or Afghanistan, Ukraine, or most recently in the Sudan, violence and insecurity are sadly features of many people's lives. This session is part of a series of psychologically informed webinars, briefings, animations, and other resources that you can find at the EAWOP Impact Incubator. And we'll be providing a link to that at the end of the entire webinar. We'll also be recording this event, and it will add to our ongoing collection of resources and materials. So let's begin. As you can see on your screen, we've got an agenda for today. So I'm going to be showing you very shortly a new animation that we've developed looking at human security. We're then going to move on to looking at the lived experiences through a brief film that we've already recorded, featuring someone who's recently had experiences of human insecurities. Although this short recording is very powerful in its content, we've decided that we're going to start and end our session with some music that's been directly inspired as a reaction to experiences of war and violent conflict. So this lived experience film will start with music that's called Why. And we'll close this part of the webinar with some other music that you might be more familiar with that's based on Bach. We've deliberately decided to make this separation to help give you and all of us some time to go into this lived experience, but also to transition out. So once that music has died away, you will then hear from my colleagues, Professor Darren Hoggett, who's Professor of Societal Psychology, and his colleague, Dr. Veronica Hopper, Senior lecturer in psychology at Massey University in New Zealand, who are going to be talking in more detail about the paper that has inspired the animation and this entire webinar. After they've finished, we'll then go into a panel discussion that features 4 very eminent psychologists from different disciplines and different parts of the world. And I'll be introducing each of them as we go through to focus on different aspects of human psychology and why they matter, from them talking from their part of the world. And this session will then close with a panel discussion that's going to be led by Professor Stuart Carr. As we're going through these sessions, you might want to ask some questions. So please use the chat function, the Q&A function, to put your questions that you would like posing to the panel at the end of this. And then Stuart will lead and ask those questions to the panel members before closing our session. So we do hope that you gain from this experience. It's all about human security, unpacking and explaining why it matters and what are its distinct components. So let's look at that animation now.
This is an animation by Professor Rosalind Searle, Professor Darren Hodgetts, Dr. Veronica Hopner, and Professor Stuart Carr. For more information and outputs on human security psychology, please visit Project SAFE at project-safe.net. Human security safeguards the vital core of all human lives from critical threats. These protections can be broken down into 10 dimensions. 1. Personal security. Personal security means living free from violence. 2. Environmental security. This concerns the integrity and health of the physical environment. 3. Economic security. This includes regular basic incomes to prevent poverty. 4. Food security. The means of physical and financial access to nutritious food. 5. Health security. Protection from disease and infection, alongside access to affordable healthcare. 6. Community security. This dimension focuses on safe neighbourhoods and peaceful intergroup relations. 7. Political security. Political security ensures basic human rights. 8. National security. The safety of countries from both traditional and non-traditional threats. 9. Cybersecurity. Encompassing the safety of information technology in critical infrastructure and associated digital hazards. And lastly, 10. Global security. Global security is important in an age of major climate change, socio-economic disruptions, and where distinctions between domestic and foreign can be redrawn. Human security psychology is a new perspective that encompasses efforts within psychology to address issues of insecurity arising from these 10 dimensions of human security. It outlines research and practice within psychology that enables human beings to not only feel safe and secure psychologically, but also to be safe and secure materially. Human security psychology also shows how different sub-disciplines of psychology contribute knowledge of and responses to issues of human security. For example, clinical counselling and health psychologies address insecurities in mental and physical health. Work psychology is about enabling decent work and economic conditions, such as income and job security. Community psychology is about promoting social ties and attachments to particular places that enable people to weather insecurities. Environmental psychology is about addressing insecurities associated with climate change and pollution. Political psychology is about enhancing political systems to ensure national security, particularly in times of intergroup conflict. By joining up these sub-disciplines of psychology, we can help security in all areas flourish by ensuring people have access to resources and are treated with dignity, fairness, and respect. As Adam Smith noted in 1776, no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. It is but equity, besides that they who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole body of the people should have such a share of the produce of their own labour as to be themselves tolerably well fed, clothed, and lodged.
So we watched the animation. Let's now look at a short film about the lived experiences of having to leave your country and human insecurity.
My name is Ludmila. I'm from Ukraine. I understand that I'm a refugee.
Your journey as a refugee didn't start in Scotland. How did that start?
on the morning we wake up to go to school, to go for our works and all our life, what we need. We thought about.
So a normal day.
Normal day. My husband took decision. We must go. Our friends from Scotland, they sent invitation for us, and we went to Scotland. It was time when you should just something do. We just thought about what we must do now. I didn't agree with my husband. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to leave my house.
So what type of support is helping you and your family?
Human warmth. It just humans understanding, and just without any words, because you can feel. When I arrived at Scotland, I felt immediately surrounded by care and support. All people very warm and kind, and I'm very grateful. And yes, I was surprised.
That people that didn't know you would do this?
Because these people didn't know me. It looks like I am not refugee. I just came in Scotland as a friend for few days or some time. And it was very important for my health, I think for my mood health, to understand that I am not alone.
So you've been here coming up for a year, and you were saying that you'd packed for 3 days.
Yes.
What looking back do you wish you could have taken with you? Is there anything?
There is no important things.
Okay.
There is life, and I realize that anything what we thought that it's very important for our life, it's not important at all. I couldn't take with me my husband, and I couldn't take with me his hugs.
What have you done? What has been helpful to you?
My children helped me with that, because they was very happy, and I thought they are smile and they laughing and they can run and just be children. I tried to be with another thoughts in my head, and it was very helpful when I put my phone, and I didn't want to be in news. I tried to be busy. I tried to do my work. I continue to work.
You're a music teacher.
It was very important for my students. I think we helped each other. It's very helpful to listen, to just relax and just forgot everything. It's special time. It's time without anything what happens around. And some people came to lesson from underground.
People that are making policies and governments, what do you think is, from your experience, what is the most important thing for them to do to help people like you?
I think they are doing very well, and I am very grateful for government, Scotland government.
How is it for you being here and people that you care about still being in Ukraine?
my husband still in Ukraine, and my relatives also in Ukraine, and my sister was living in occupied territory. And one time I just didn't know, did she alive? I don't know how to say, be careful. I don't know how I can help with their life. They are so far away. With encourage, with every help which we have, I still feel my true life in another part of world. Difficult to realize that I don't know how much it will be, how much it will be continue. I understand that I live, it's like a tree without ground. This tree has roots, but these roots on the space, just on air. This tree pulled out from the ground, and you can fly like a tree without ground.
Thanks everyone for opening up this really important conversation. The video we have just watched is really grounded and experiential exemplar of how human security works, and we will return to the Ukraine war later. In the next few slides, we will talk about the research and the paper we have published about human security psychology. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Veronica, and thanks, Ros and team, for organising today's webinar. What we thought we might do is talk a little bit about the genesis of the article, which really is the coming together of a diverse group of scholars from a range of different contexts, from Brazil to Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, the United Kingdom, and of course, New Zealand. In New Zealand, we had initiated this work through some discussions we had been having with various colleagues around insecurities, or different forms of insecurity, economic in particular, but also health and so forth. And we started wondering or thinking about how these things can actually work in concert, and these different forms of human security can come together within human life worlds. It became apparent, as well as we were exploring more in the security studies and psychology of security space, that many approaches or many dimensions of human security are often siloed and are not really connected up with each other. And what we did is we actually went through and did a bit of a disciplinary stock take in psychology to understand how our discipline understands human security and what we do to foster it or to promote it, and how different sub-disciplinary areas contribute to that. At the same time, Stuart, who's speaking tonight as well, led the development of a scale to measure different dimensions of human security and to see what the priorities were for different groups of people. At this point, we started thinking a little bit more conceptually as well about how we might build a theoretical understanding of human security that brings these dimensions together, so we can start looking at interactions between them as well as within them. And at this point, we also started talking to colleagues globally, and you'll see that there's quite a few authors on this particular article, and formed Project SAFE as a way of promoting a conversation on more of a global scale. What we were also interested in is the dynamic and the evolving and emerging ways in which insecurities in particular manifest and change over time. And we thought that it might be good to then take a holistic approach at looking at human security as a dynamic and shifting set of dimensions. And this led us, of course, to assemblage theory, which we'll talk about a little bit tonight, because it offered one way for us to bring these diverse approaches to human security together, but also to think about how the different dimensions actually operate in relation to one another. So we do really hope that this is an initial step in doing some useful and practical work. Next slide, please.
The term human security was first offered in 1994 and placed people, their protection and flourishing as the centre of security-related matters. This signalled a clear shift from conventional views of human security that had been primarily concerned with the safety and integrity of the nation state. Instead, the 1994 United Nations Development Programme, UNDP report, advanced a much broader and more holistic understanding of human security. This understanding was primarily made up of 7 separate but interconnected dimensions, and we can see those first 7 on the screen: personal, health, food, environmental, community, economic, and political. In 2020, a further 2 dimensions were added: national and cybersecurity, to reflect the changes around, especially around cybersecurity, that had taken place in the world. And in 2022, against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, global security was formally proposed as the 10th dimension. For the first time, conceptualizing human security within these different dimensions firmly connected issues of human development and prosperity to matters of national and international security. Next slide, please.
So just by way of conceptual background, assemblage theory was introduced by Deleuze and Guattari as an attempt to make sense of the processes via which any whole or entity in the world, from molecules to natural ecosystems, species to ecosystems, takes form. Both natural, material, and socio-cultural entities are considered interdependent from this theoretical perspective. And this is evident, for example, in how increasingly severe weather events are shaped by human-induced climate change processes. As such, mitigating changes to climate requires rethinking human practices associated with the present political and economic systems. Now, foundational to assemblage theory is an orientation towards the world as an emerging ecosystem that takes shape through dynamics of stability and instability across a nexus of different assemblages. So what we get is assemblages piling on assemblages and making up the planet that we all inhabit together. Now, these assemblages are constituted through the drawing and holding together of heterogeneous human and non-human elements, and these might include persons, institutions, technologies, places, procedures and norms, and so forth. And these are held together within a relational terrain, or what's called a geography of relations. And of course, entities, the logic in assemblage theory is not a logic of either or, that a particular entity like a person is only evident in one assemblage. The same element can be evident across a whole range of different assemblages that populate their life. So as such, human security from this perspective is entangled within a nexus of socio-political, cultural, economic, natural, personal relationships within which various elements fit together and mutually influence one another. And that's something that's of particular interest to us as a group. Next slide, please.
So the Ukraine war shows how various dimensions and elements of human security can assemble, cohere, shift and change. And I'll have a try here of trying to give a concrete example of assemblage theory. The artillery shelling, bomb explosions and troop movements have wreaked havoc on the natural and built infrastructures. This has led to severe environmental destruction with the contamination of water sources, damage to sanitary systems, widespread deforestation, and significant impacts on air quality. Agricultural production has also been severely disrupted, exacerbating food insecurity, both now and for the foreseeable future. Both Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of grain, energy, and fertilizers, and the disruption to production or transit of these commodities has increased prices, contributing to rising inflation, which in turn has impacted global economic security. Thousands of Ukrainians have died and millions have been displaced from their homes, leaving behind the security of homes, jobs, communities, and the political stability of their largely peaceful nation. This forced migration has put significant pressure on neighbouring countries such as Poland, who received 1.1 million refugees in the first 12 days of the war. Many of these refugees needed immediate attention, suffering from exposure, hunger, dehydration, and underlying medical conditions, placing stress on Polish healthcare services that were already under strain from COVID-19. The war in Ukraine is also termed a hybrid war, and I'm going to quote Bilal 2021 here. And this is the idea that this is a combination of conventional and unconventional strategies, methods and tactics in contemporary warfare, as well as the psychological or information-related aspects of modern conflicts. Ongoing cyber war has battered critical infrastructures, released malware, and distributed denial of services that has not only targeted Russia and Ukraine, but has also compromised other European networks. Information warfare, especially disinformation in the form of fake news, fake live streams, and deep fake videos have proliferated through this conflict. Considering the whole human security assemblage and strategic thinking is necessary at a global level, especially within institutions such as the UN and the European Union, or military alliances such as NATO. In respect to the war in Ukraine, the Economic Union has imposed sanctions on selected Russian individuals and organizations in areas of travel, banking, some forms of trade, transport, and the media. However, there is no restriction on Russian imports of food and agricultural products, such as food security is seen as a major priority for the EU. Understanding human security as an assemblage or a geography as relations, as Darren has just talked about, allows for the consideration of consequences that particular actions, political, economic, etc., have on other dimensions or elements of human security. It is crucial to understand human security as an assemblage, as none of the dimensions and elements that form this assemblage can exist in separation from each other. Notwithstanding this, at times it may be useful to consider the human security matrix in all its entirety, and at other times to focus on specific dimensions or relationships. Determining which focus to take will be shaped by the objectives of any action and dependent on the urgency generated by particular contexts. For example, in decision-making processes pertaining to humanitarian aid and or military interventions in a war or conflict, or for the purposes of research endeavours. And I'll now hand over to talk to Darren about future research, which is the slide we're now at.
Thanks, Veronica. And as Veronica's saying there, you know, the scale at which one investigates these processes or intervenes within them is quite important. So we're thinking from the micro out to the macro and back again, and how these things interrelate and shape each other in kind of cascades that can occur in events such as what's happening in the Ukraine at the present. So in terms of what we've been doing and are embarking on, we've continued some of the work with the scale, and we've been looking at how different nation states and so on prioritize different dimensions of human security at different times and why. We've also been mapping how different elements of human security are territorialized or brought into connective alliance within this geography of relations that constitute assemblages, or the assembling of the different dimensions, and how this relates to different instances of insecurity or human insecurity. We're extending our understanding of the relational processes between different dimensions of assemblages, and this is going to be an ongoing focus for many members of SAFE and our group. One example at the moment, we're working with a PhD student looking at the New Zealand welfare system, and we're looking at how different policies that are supposedly designed to promote economic and housing security enter into precariat households and who face a raft of economic, housing and food insecurities. So we're looking at the agency of policies within the dynamics of households and what impacts it actually has on the ground, with a view to then going back and informing, and which we're doing at the moment, the reshaping of these policies to make them more effective in that dynamic space. We're also engaging in rural and urban community partnerships to better understand and localise, look at local issues of human security in the different dimensions. So Stuart and myself and some others are working with Southland in New Zealand, looking at different ways of looking at social impacts around things like the introduction of a hydrogen plant and how that may create some economic activities, but it can also come with a range of issues. And as part of that work, we're trying to shift from the notion of social impacts to looking at social regeneration and how industry can actually contribute to that. And finally, we're considering how psychology can be assembled and reassembled in a sense to heighten our contributions to addressing various issues of human insecurity. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Darren, and thank you, Veronica, for that really clear talk through the paper, highlighting the different aspects. So let us shift now to focusing in more detail at some of these. We're going to have a panel discussion now with different members of our panel highlighting different issues. So I'd like to start with Gustavo Massola, who is the Professor of Environmental Psychology at the University of São Paulo in Brazil. So Gustavo, can you talk to us about environmental security and, focusing on your beautiful country of Brazil, outline why it matters in this context? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosalind, and thank you very much for all the organizers. I'm going to read a brief text in order to stick within time. And well, let's talk about some not very beautiful parts of my country, you know. Well, I would like to address the environmental dimension of human security psychology from the case of the Brazilian Amazon. Through it, we can get a glimpse of the possible relationships between environmental security and other dimensions of human security. The Amazon rainforest has an area of approximately 6 million square kilometers, and approximately 60% of its total area is in Brazil, in the area known as the legal Amazon, home to almost 30 million people, which presents the greatest cultural diversity in Brazil, including more than half of the Brazilian indigenous population. Perhaps the best known problem in the Amazon region is deforestation. Every year, just through fire action, Brazil loses approximately 68,000 square kilometers of Amazonian vegetation cover. Other environmental problems include illegal mining activities and bioparcy, which leads to the destruction of ecosystems that guarantee the survival of thousands of communities. The Brazilian Environmental Monitoring Agency had approximately 300 employees capable of field activities in the legal Amazon in 2021. The Amazon region also presents the highest homicide rate in Brazil, up to 36 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants per year. A considerable number of these deaths occur due to land disputes. The region is a well-known international drug trafficking corridor and is seen in Brazil as a lawless land, a serious threat to national security. The southern half of Brazil, the most productive agricultural area in the world, has an abundance of water that comes precisely from the Amazon through the so-called flying rivers. Flying rivers are immense volumes of water vapor that come from the Atlantic Ocean, precipitate as rain in the Amazon, and then continue to the southern half of the country. On some days of the year, a river the size of the Amazon River crosses the skies of Brazil. This rainfall regime has been entirely modified with the advancement of deforestation in the Amazon. Simultaneously, the Amazonian economy is the least developed in the country, has poor infrastructure, and is in many ways isolated from the rest of the country. Thus, we cannot understand the Amazon region without understanding that environmental security is related simultaneously to personal, economic, food, health, political, and national security. At the same time, the Amazon is a central element in ensuring global security. Psychology plays an essential role in ensuring human safety in the region. Given its characteristics, environmental psychology intervenes in identifying the main environmental stressors and in planning against action against environmental degradation. Community psychologists working with local communities serve as a tool for organizing defenses against violence and disintegration. Clinical psychologists develop tools to intervene in local communities and combat, for example, the high rate of suicides among young people, the highest in the country. The absence of an explicit concern for human security does not prevent Brazilian psychology from dealing with the problems in the region and their interconnections, acting directly to address insecurity. However, the development of a concept relating the psychological aspects of all these dimensions will certainly contribute to a better psychological understanding and action on these issues. Thank you very much, Ross, and everyone.
Thank you so much, Gustavo, for really opening up. I had no idea the idea about a river in the air. That's a wonderful way of thinking about it, but also of highlighting the level of destruction. And you were really starting to unpick and showing the interconnectivity here. So our next speaker is Professor Ute-Christine Klehe, who has the chair in Work and Organisational Psychology from the Justus Liebig University Giessen in Germany. She studies career self-management, career transitions, and particularly those facing economic stress. So over to you, Christina.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you. And thank you for allowing me to be part of this. So when we talk about economic stress, we talk about aspects about kind of the employment and income dimensions of the worker-earner role that are potential stresses to employees and their families. So directly, this speaks to economic security. Situations like underemployment, people working below their aspirations and abilities, or in insecure jobs, which quite often then also predict the advent of unemployment. And these different economic stresses we know are quite interrelated, one quite often leading to the other and reversely. Generally, there is quite a bit of research on this area. But there's also quite a bit of research getting back to your interview with Lev Miller and what Veronica was talking about in the situation of refugees, where we had like all these different aspects of security interrelating to make people leave, And now one would hope that once they reach a new country, kind of safe haven, that they would be safe. But unfortunately, we know this is not the case. So quite often they lack communities and interconnectedness. They are the foreigners. Quite often they remain unemployed, have really hard difficulties getting into the labor market, and if then only at a low level, so this economic security remains threatened. Quite often we have health issues such as PTSD being unseen because of communication issues in the host country and remaining untreated. And to that come like political dimensions in terms of being exposed to an intransparent, quite often also quite unkind migration system, possibly with like the fear of being sent back or not knowing how long am I allowed to remain in this country, or might I be sent back to some other country, maybe my home country or a country I encountered during my travels to this host country. And then there are also aspects to personal security, freedom from violence. I mean, in the extreme case, this can be physical, but this can also be psychological in terms of a violation of the basic understanding of who we really are. And so what we know from economic stress in general, not only speaking about refugees, but in general, that it can really undermine people's health in terms of it threatens like essential vitamins that we need in our lives. Like an income helps us shape our lives in a way as we want to do. It gives us some autonomy in how we want to live. We need social connections also from work to be part of a group, to be connected to others. And work also gives us our social status and our experience of competence. And if we don't have this really, as we've seen in different research with the unemployed, it really undermines our sense of self-worth. We don't have this daily work with which to experience self-efficacy, competency, making a contribution. And what comes on top of it is that people in these situations, quite often they start blaming themselves and they feel a sense of shame about it. And this might get even stronger because society quite often doesn't treat them very kindly either, but not only threatens existing views of how we see ourselves, but also imposes negative stereotypes on these people. So treating them as benefits grounders, for example, or as no good because otherwise that person would be working. And this also threatens our sense of self-distinctiveness. So the whole experiences and expertise that one might have accumulated in one's former life suddenly no longer count. But when one approaches a potential new employer, one might feel stigmatized as, oh, that's another guy with gray hair, like an older job seeker, or yeah, that's another guy with like a weird accent, as a foreigner. And with this also our sense of continuity might get lost, like with our lost identities towards our job, but also in the wider setting as a breadwinner, as a member of society. And this really disrupts our self-definitions, and it becomes worse as people sense that they don't have any control anymore about this. Generally speaking, we all want to be in the driver's seats of our lives, but once you're unemployed and you face these constant reactions, you might get a sense of relearned helplessness, and also the sense of like this human capital that I might have accumulated before, it doesn't count that much anymore. And it is other people who define who we are. And all this together, it doesn't really surprise that economic stress is related to depression, to anxiety, to psychosomatic issues. Cortisol levels go up, immune functioning goes down. People feel quite miserable. And actually we see, or research has found, that the unemployed have a 63% higher death ratio than employed people. So being unemployed is a predictor of actually dying. related to health issues, at some point also related to unhealthy behavior, starting from suicide, direct, but also increased level of drug abuse, unhealthy diet, less exercise, less hygiene. People take less care of themselves once they fall into unemployment. What makes things worse, also the self-regulation needed in order to get back into employment is impaired as well, in terms of people having less of a solid daily time structure that enables them to kind of get the things done and investing the time needed to find work. And also, and this is something we see with long-term unemployed, and we see very much also with refugees, a sense of long-time planning really changes. There's a greater sense of insecurity, but at the same time, we know planning is so very, very important for gaining reemployment, but particularly gaining high quality employment. And so you see how these different factors interrelate. And we also see, actually colleagues of us see a scarring effect in terms of like how people feel about their lives, their life satisfaction. It goes down when we're unemployed, yes. It goes up if we find a new job, but the new job quite often is less secure and of less quality than the job we had before. And we might lose it again, which then makes our life satisfaction go down again. And if then we find a job again and so on, there is a strong link between employment status and satisfaction, but you also see the scarring effect that over time, with every instance of unemployment, life satisfaction also when employed does go down. And so you see a bit of these relationships between each other. Thank you.
Our next panel member is Malcom MacLachlan, who is the Professor of Psychology and Social Inclusion and the co-director of ALL, which is Assisting Living and Learning Institute at Maynooth University in Ireland. So Mac had the experience, and I find this really daunting, of becoming the inaugural Director of Clinical Lead for Disability Services in Ireland, just as the pandemic struck. So he's really been living on the sharp end in terms of witnessing the impact on people's lives of this. So Mac, would you like to share with us your insights in terms of health security, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rosalind. And also thank you to everyone who's been involved in putting this really interesting webinar together. So yeah, I particularly want to talk about the sort of organizational aspects of how a health system responds to the insecurity that was visited on all of us by COVID. So I guess when you set up a clinical program, what you really want to try and establish is a role for that program and effectively a position, a status within the overall health system. So the disability workforce in Ireland is around 27,000 people. And of course, there's hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities who were anticipated to be, I guess, vulnerable, many of them to infections. So that was one of the reasons for wanting to kick off a disability program at that point, really just about a month after the onset of COVID in Ireland. Now, one of the perhaps surprising things with COVID is it actually gave us as a clinical program an opportunity to fast track, or as I call it, sort of clinical speed dating. So often a new program would take many years and have many sort of sequential physical meetings 1 week after another. But COVID actually meant that what might have taken a couple of years was actually achieved in a couple of months, because we just had multiple, I guess, crisis type meetings, but they were continuous meetings throughout that time and throughout the whole organization. So it actually allowed us as a program to sort of embed within the health system much more effectively. And because we were able to embed within the health system, we were able to have more effectiveness more quickly. But one of the challenges that very quickly came up to us, I guess, is the idea of marginalization. And, you know, insecurity is unequal. So in very stark terms, certainly at the onset of COVID, people were talking very much about who to save. So in terms of intubation or resuscitation, in those situations when the demand was too great, how would people decide who should be prioritized effectively for saving? And one of the initial suggestions was that people would use a thing called the frailty index to identify those who might benefit most from intubation or resuscitation. But as some of you might know, the mobility index, because it looks at mobility, assumes that if you're not terribly mobile, you must be fragile. And if you're fragile, then you must be more vulnerable to infection. So from the point of view of our program, of course, there's many people with disability who may not be particularly mobile, but who are actually perfectly healthy and are just as likely to successfully fight off infection as anybody else. So one of our early challenges, if you like, was to reduce the marginalization of people with disability, not because they were physically marginalized, but because of the attitudes and the presumptions of staff, not ill-intentioned, but ill-informed. So we had to give people the appropriate information, but we also had to sort of emotionally challenge their attitudes by effectively asking them on what basis they were judging whether somebody was deserving of prioritization or saving in this case. Also, in terms of resilience, one of the things that we learned is that you can actually do more than you think in these crisis situations. So initially, the health system very much sort of stuttered and sort of choked and I guess convulsed. That many clinicians, you know, to be honest, panicked and were quite disorientated because the systems that had worked in a very different way weren't aligned with the sort of new challenges. Then, if you like, a more sort of systems thinking approach started to kick in, and people looked at diverting resources to where they were most needed. So, for instance, the national health system effectively commandeered beds from within private hospitals that previously hadn't been available to people in the national health system. Staff were redeployed from perhaps less urgent areas to the sort of front line of COVID, and also virtual services were set up. So we started doing things better than we actually thought that we could do things better. And I think one of the big learnings there was the workforce became more hopeful. And so health security actually needs hopeful staff in terms of having the capacity to respond to the challenges. And then lastly, I just want to mention what I would call being sort of shamelessly opportunistic, or perhaps not wanting to waste a crisis. So we had been aware for some time of the need to try and embrace digital and virtual services, if you like, to move some services online. But there had been quite considerable resistance to this. Very important for me to say, we're not talking about replacing face-to-face or person-to-person services, but rather augmenting those services. But in COVID, there wasn't really an opportunity to have person-to-person services. So when we looked at, for instance, doing assessments of people's needs, previously we'd found that different professions, including the psychology profession, had been very resistant to the idea that these could be done adequately from a virtual place. And also the unions had been very resistant to that idea because of potential industrial relations issues. So something that might have taken literally 3 or 4 years to negotiate, we found that within a month, we were able to develop new guidelines to do virtual assessments. And sometimes clinicians reported that they've actually felt that those assessments were more effective than actually person-to-person assessments. Now, we've gone back to a situation where we have person-to-person assessments, but from time to time, people do use virtual assessments, and that sometimes allows people to attend assessments who can't physically attend them, or it interferes with their schooling or their work and so on. So there is opportunism even in really direly challenging circumstances. So I think health security intersects in multiple ways with other types of security, because these other types of security and insecurity are often the things that marginalize or include people in health services. So the interaction of the different human securities here, I think, is one of the key messages from this webinar. And back to you, Rosalind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mac. So our last panel member tonight is Dr. Jelena Zikic, who is the Associate Professor at the school. Sorry, she's the Associate Professor at York University in Toronto, Canada, in the School of Human Resource Management. Her research focuses on career management issues, combining the individual as well as the organisational perspective, and she's particularly interested in career transitions and coping and career development, particularly for this group. So, Jelena, we can see on your slide you've already identified some of these overlapping insecurities that the others have highlighted. Can you talk about them in this space, please?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm joining this webinar from Toronto, from Canada, and that's an important piece of information for the topic that I will address briefly. Namely, probably many of you know that, like some of your countries, Canada is often called a land of immigrants and refugees recently as well. And also Toronto as a city, as a host city, as a context, has also been named sanctuary city. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this term, but sanctuary cities are several across North America in particular, and they really promote ideals of human rights, community growth, and things like access to services without fear of deportation. So really relevant for undocumented immigrants in particular. So just to kind of set the stage related to what I'm talking about, cities and contexts in which we navigate, especially, as refugees or migrants coming into a new place, have a powerful influence in terms of our well-being, as well as how we cope with some of the challenges such as finding work, so economic security, just in general, feeling good about the place and connecting to the community. So these few points come from a recent paper that looks at this idea of how do migrants in particular, but it could be applied to refugees as well, how do they connect to the location, to the community in which they're settling, and what impact can that have on their integration? And integration can mean a lot of different things, such as, having a job, feeling safe, having making a living, having safety for your family, etc., and making connections to that community. And so one of the things that's important to understand at the start is that as we start navigating in a new place, walking around, exploring streets, sites in the new place, we often can feel isolated. And this is an important part of that initial connection with the city, because we often go back to our memories and we connect to things that we are familiar with, such as our home cities. And we do these, what we call city comparisons. why is this important? Well, it's important because it relates later to our belonging, as well as to our ability to feel safe, secure, and to do all those tasks that we need as we settle in a new place. And from the wonderful video, we heard about Ludmila's, I believe is the name of the interviewee. We heard about her connections with people in Scotland and her initial impressions. And so those are the kinds of connections that we build or try to build in the community. Some of this work is also connected to what we call psychology of place. And it has a lot to do with our attachment, with our sense of belongingness. So third point has to do with, as we're navigating this new place, connecting it maybe to something that's familiar, like home city, we're also often looking for sites, looking for specific places. And in our paper, we call these, or we use boundary objects theory, which really talks about all these places and things that we're looking for and how they create boundary between us and the local community. And so reaching places and finding services and resources, basic things such as, where do I buy newspaper? Where do I find job ads? Is there maybe an agency? Is there a job search consultant or a person that I can talk to? All of those connections as we navigate the new community are important in terms of getting us to the next stage of feeling good about the place and creating a community, really within a community. One of the things that we find in this paper that I just want to highlight that's really interesting finding is that early experiences of navigating a host city have a very important impact on later integration. And so in researching refugees and migrants and their career transitions, we're often concerned about their ability to integrate, to become part of the community, and eventually to give back. And so those early experiences in the new city really can shape how you integrate. And in our paper, we find two ways that people can relate to the community later on. One we call functional integration, which just means I'm here to get what I need and, to function in a sense, versus holistic integration that happens when the reciprocity between local community and the newcomers was positive. And I'm holistically integrated when I can give back later on. And so this is in a nutshell what I wanted to share, just to highlight that reciprocity between newcomers and the local community is really important, can shape integration. And in this work that we're doing, we're really interested in this kind of physical, social embeddedness, and finally, how that impacts our job search and our ability to function as newcomers. So thank you very much for giving me a chance to share some of my work.
Well, thank you, Jelena. Ros, I think that's over to me now, eh?
Yes.
Yeah, lovely. Can you start by thanking the panel for those amazing perspectives and insightful and actually very encouraging reflections on how things actually fit together. My role in this last tail end of the session is the wrap up, and I guess that's about joining up. And I found the whole presentation today extremely moving, actually. And I thank the panelists, thank Ludmila, thanks to the team for organising, and thanks for people to coming along. Looking back, one broad reflection would be that we've, a few decades ago, it seems we were kind of obsessed. If there was something that we were focused on a lot in psychology and related disciplines, it might have been happiness. And that's kind of, in some ways, I think, as going back to the beginning, Ros was saying, has been kind of replaced by security. And let's be honest, it's not really security, it's insecurity. And in things in my own area, like humanitarian work psychology, that would be precarious work, which is now widespread. across the world for the vast majority of workers. So it's actually insecurity. So instead of things like self-esteem, job satisfaction, and so on, it's you know, existential security and addressing precariousness. And you know, getting to a state of security is kind of like a minimum, really, and from insecurity. And beyond that, we might be thinking, if we were to look for a kind of modern, contemporary, positive focus, it might be sustainability, or perhaps, as Darren was saying, regeneration. So the world has changed, and this animation, I guess, and the Incubator and the tricentenary of Adam Smith are focused on what we can do about it. And my role as a wrap up is trying to facilitate some questions and have a panel discussion. I'm just looking at the webinar chat. We don't actually have any questions in there for the moment, but while we're waiting for them to come into the box, I was thinking, well, hearing the panelists there, I started to see some joined up connections coming through. And Gustavo, for example, was talking about really elaborating and illustrating how psychologists of all different denominations are actually working together against the environmental crisis in Brazil, which of course ripples around the world. And I was really impressed with the way, Gustavo, you were talking about, you know, community psychologists working with environmental psychologists, with clinical psychologists. And let's be honest, most of us are siloed in our respective parts of the discipline. So that's really encouraging. It's joined up and it's interbranched. And then I think Mac picked that up. He talked about a COVID accelerated action organizationally and in terms of human services as well, and about insecurity being unequal. And I think starting to go towards Adam Smith's quotation, which was in the animation there. And Mac, you were talking about intersectionality. So, you know, across health, across work, across human services and intersocial inclusion and so on. So I could see connections and wrap up and joining up there. And then Eleanor, you talked about reaching human services as well. So you followed really smoothly, I think, from what Mac was saying, and you talked about intersections there for people moving to the sanctuary cities and the role of geography and place, which I guess is, you know, back to that interdisciplinary. So we've seen intradisciplinary across psychology, HRM, and so on, and then interdisciplinary into geography and place. And I think if we put all that together, as I can't try and wrap that up into a question, because we still haven't got any questions in the chat box. I've had one in my back pocket, and I wondered, going back to Adam Smith's quotation there, if he was alive today, and I guess it's a tricentenary, so he'd be a tricentenarian. I was going to ask, maybe go around the panel if we can, and ask you, what would you say to Adam Smith about where we, and it's a broad we, I guess, we can add value to human security? And I know you've talked about it in your presentations, but maybe that's a question we could start with, and we could go around the panel in any order, I think. What would we say to Adam Smith in terms of what we can add going forward to human security in this 21st century and tricentenary for Adam Smith? Mac, go for it.
I think I'd say, Adam, you're right, but it's going to take a while. I think that the challenge that Smith lays out is absolutely correct, and it's sort of worrying that we are not in a place where arguably we're any closer to addressing this. I'm recalling, Stu, that you and I attended a meeting at the OECD. Maybe it was a couple of decades ago now, but it was at a time when within France there was commentary about increasing inequality within France, and I don't think that has been, you know, fully addressed at all as yet. I think inequality is probably still increasing. So I guess for me, what it brings up is the question about if human security psychology can address these sorts of big questions, what are the other sort of disciplines or players that needs to be in the room with Adam, so that psychology can leverage other things outside psychology as well. And I guess I'm thinking of economics, obviously in terms of Adam Smith, but also social policy. People mentioned before about different cultural differences and different values, challenges around integration and marginalization and so on. And it's really worrying that you would have someone 300 years ago naming these challenges quite correctly, and we're a long way from there. So I think it's a very sobering thought.
Thank you, Mac. And as you're speaking there, I mentioned sustainability, which is might be the antidote to insecurity, and thinking of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the One Process goal. And years ago, we were talking about process and process skills at that meeting, and others. You're talking there about partnerships. And I know from a work psychology point of view, we've been very ignorant of what's been going on in public health around the benefits of raising wages to human, even just moderately secure levels. So I hear you there about partnerships, and that it is shocking that not much seems to have changed. But I guess anyway, I'd be interested to see what the rest of the panel thinks about the possibility of moving forward from where we were 300 years ago. I agree with you, it's very sobering. Thanks, Mac. Does anybody else in the panel want to chime in? We haven't got any questions in the chat box yet, so you're on the spot still.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Mac. I think it's an interesting idea to compare the idea of insecurity and sustainability. In many ways, sustainability has also a lot of dimensions, and sustainability has to incorporate cultural, environmental, work dimensions as well. I guess as psychologists, in my case as a social, environmental psychologist, I would say that in Brazil, we make an effort not to create a very strict border between these disciplines of psychology. So in many cases, we have environmental and community psychologists, for example, joining forces to help communities to solve territorial conflicts. In many cases, environmental psychologists, for example, when it comes to the problem of trash in big cities in Brazil, they have to use tools that come from community psychologists in order to help poor parts of the population, poor neighbors, to face, address, fight against environmental degradation, trash and rivers, etc. So I think that as psychologists, we have a lot to contribute to in this sense. One of the aspects in Brazil of these efforts is that Brazil has a unique situation in the world, because it's been 40 years more or less that our economy don't grow over the population growth in economical terms. So we can say that we are stuck economically in the last 40 years. One of the problems we have is how to decide where to invest, because one of the problems the economists bring to the discussion is that they don't have the tools to decide what society defines as priority. And psychology has a lot of tools to help with that. So I think that as psychologists, we can actually contribute to other areas of knowledge that are very important in order to address these issues that cause insecurity in our societies. I think that the key issue for us in Brazil is that it's necessary to have political force, to have political power in order to implement some changes and help find the solutions for some problems. So I brought the question or the case of the Amazon because it is a very important, a central problem in Brazil, and a central, how can I say, it's an important part of Brazil. It can bring a lot of good things, but we don't have the political power, and we don't have the political coordination to act in order to reduce insecurity in the region. So I think we can help other areas, we can help each other, and we have to plan strategically how to be able to have the political power to be able, well, to be able to do those things. That's sort of what I thought.
Obrigado. Thank you so much, Gustavo. Yeah, it's that point you're making about linking to engaging with power, and I guess that links to the idea of, you know, having influences on policy is actually crucial to what happens next. And in humanitarian work psychology, we have colleagues based in Geneva at CSEN that have been arguing for a long time that we need to improve our diplomacy skills, or new diplomacies as they call them. So, you know, it's all very well having the research and so on, but there comes a point when you need to persuade people, and sometimes words aren't enough. You need, obviously, you need action. That means that research runs out of road at a certain point in time, and it becomes community action that makes a difference. Thank you so much, Gustavo. I'm just wondering if Jelena would like to say anything on that. What would we say to
I just have a quick point. I don't know if it's directly related to your question or not, but as I was listening to different, you know, perspectives, I thought what's even more important in our, you know, day and age is the emphasis on relationships that people build in different communities, from my perspective. So the importance of sort of like social capital and what refugees or migrants bring to the local context and how they can connect to others. So that's just the emphasis on relationships I just see so valuable in all of our conversations.
Yeah, it's something, yeah, I agree totally. It's something we forget very often as a society or societies that, and it's been our experience in New Zealand. I'm sure Veronica and Darren would agree that, well, we've discussed it many times, that when change has happened, when policies have been moved, and it's happened a few times, and it's hopeful of it happening again, it's really come down to quality relationships and relational ethics that have been, you know, either long-standing relationships or relationships that have built up over many years and have ended up playing a role in getting things changed. And that needs to come together with the evidence and all the rest of it, the theory. The animation is a huge part of that. I mean, I have to say that I mean, the meaning of animation is to bring to life, to move. And we're talking about emotional topics here. And the animation, and congratulations to the Impact Incubator for producing it so well. It's Becky and so on, and Roz, of course, and so on. It really does move. It uses words, but it uses images, and then they combine to actually to animate. And anyway, I've drifted a bit, but thank you, Jelena. Yeah, great. I see there's a comment from Veronica here. Yeah, tax. You're talking about tax, Veronica. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, it was just recently, we've had a report come out in New Zealand where the top 2% of the wealthiest households own 25% of the country's net worth and financial assets, and yet only pay just under 9% of tax on that, compared to sort of 14 for people that are that are on much lower sort of incomes at the bottom. And there seems to be very little political appetite to date to change this. And I just wondered whether or not, given that this 2% of people obviously are a very limited amount of voters, and you know, we've got a party that is supposed to be kind of protecting working class and sort of below, really. It started to make me think that, do we somehow see capitalism as a form of political security? And so therefore we're sort of somehow afraid to rupture it, but we're still, which keeps in place this really much growing inequalities that people have talked about here. And I just wondered what sort of people's comments might be there, that somehow are we holding in place this very unequal kind of system, thinking that it's giving us political security, and that the payoff is that the very wealthy people can continue to kind of get a lot more benefits from the system than anybody else is actually getting.
Anybody?
Yeah. I think, Veronica, that but we have a situation that maybe is worse in Brazil. The 1%, the 0.1% of the richest part of the country owns 50% of the wealth of the country in Brazil. And actually, for this part of society, Brazil is kind of a paradise in terms of tax payment, and not for the rest of the society, but just for this part of the society. It's very difficult to change that. We have in Brazil a very important health system that is based on the UK health system, the public health system, and it was responsible during the pandemics for helping the poor part of the Brazilian society. So when Mac was talking about the health professionals and the pandemics, and I was remembering that in Brazil we had a very difficult situation because of the government. I'm not sure if you remember, but during the pandemics we had an extreme right president, and who was a denier of the pandemic. The pandemics, he didn't think the pandemics was important or anything like that. But the health professionals, they as we said, they held the hand of the population, and psychologists were a very important part of this effort. We also had here in Brazil a resistance towards the adoption of virtual clinical appointments in psychology, and during the pandemics, we rapidly developed online systems to attend the population, especially here at the Institute of Psychology of São Paulo. We created a service that had about 1,500 appointments a year during the pandemics. What I'm trying to say is that this health system is very underfinanced here because of this difference in income and tax payment. And the Brazilian system is responsible for about 200 million people, but the UK health system costs eight times more than the Brazilian system, you know. So we have 1/8 of the budget of the UK health system here for a public health system. And it's a problem, it's a political problem, obviously, but it affects directly the security or insecurity of our population. So I would say that within this capitalist society, we would have a lot to progress if we had some changes, and maybe it's something that we have to act. We have to act towards doing this. How can we change that? How can we help society change that structure? I'm not sure if we can do that as psychologists, but I think that we can help joining forces with other areas of knowledge and other professionals. I think our action would be really important. I'm sure about it.
Absolutely. I mean, the deeper question is how far upstream can psychology and related collaborating disciplines, whatever, go to change the actual system, which is, which includes tax. Veronica and I were at a work psychology conference, SIOP conference, just recently, a session on quiet quitting, and a phrase was used: work isn't working. And I think people are saying here, tax isn't working either, and it's creating inequities within countries, fueling those inequities that Adam Smith was talking about, both within countries and across countries, as Mac was talking about, and Elena was talking about as well, actually. So, that idea of psychology and related disciplines, maybe HRM as well, we haven't been that, management-related disciplines, work-related disciplines haven't been that good at challenging the actual system and going upstream. And I think we've got to get more skilled at doing that in partnership with other groups, community groups and so on. Oh, here we've got a question coming in. Do you think the community awareness of, I'll maybe read it and then the panel can each chime in. Do you think the community awareness of vulnerability increased during COVID, but that awareness has reduced since COVID? Found Mac's talk interesting, as I've recently become disabled and found help wonderful during COVID, plus friends forming groups online for mutual support and comments relevant to the participants. Thank you for that, whoever sent it in. I don't know, it's mentioning yourself, Mac. I don't know if you want to comment on that. I think it's mentioning several things you said in your talk.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice comment, and really chimes in with this idea that in situations of adversity, people pull together more, and there's a greater common identity and more mutual supporting. And when I was listening to Gustavo talking there and remembering the great sort of community psychology within Brazil, I was also trying to reflect on to what extent has psychology driven some of this problem, because there's been such a strong sort of individuation within psychology over many decades, where the individual has been held to be so sort of primary, that many of our political systems reflect that idea of supporting individuals rather than supporting communities. I recently got a taxi ride in Copenhagen, and I was talking to the taxi driver about the very high rates of tax in Denmark, and he said to me, "I don't mind paying taxes because I can see where they're spent." And I thought, whoa, that's really interesting, because in many countries you can't see where they're spent, and so people pull back. I want to keep my money. Type of thing, and you have these very right-wing perspectives. So whether it's around people with disability feeling, greater community support, or indeed the sort of shift to this more radical right, I think psychology really does have a role in influencing how people think about values in society and how resources should be distributed. So I would be agreeing with Adam on that one.
Very nice. Yeah, and as you said, Mac, adversity can foster affiliation, and as the comment suggested as well. And I guess that the main challenge that's facing the world, or our species at least, is the environmental challenge. If we lose the environment, we lose everything. And I guess that's going to force, necessity is the mother of innovation. It may actually foster those partnerships that everyone has been talking about and strengthen them. I see that we've got another comment related to that in the chat box there. As you highlight, human security is an interconnected problem that spans different disciplines, and partnership, SDG 17, is important to deal with human security. So the question is, how can psychologists collaborate across disciplines to contribute to the solution of the interconnected problem of human security? I'm sure Adam would like that. I've noted the time and we're coming up to the end, so maybe we'll make this the last question if anybody from the panel wishes to speak to it, and then we'll close off the webinar. It's a good place to end, I think.
I think we have a lot of possibilities to collaborate. I think the tradition of the psychological field of studies in each country is different, but I think, for example, in many cases, for example, I have had students from economy, and I'm remembering it because they attended to my classes and they asked me to teach in their institute because they needed a better understanding of how people decide things, how they think, how they feel, because they don't have that in economy here in Brazil. They have all the graphs and they have all the math, but they don't have the feeling of the individual they are working with and they are affecting. I think that it's important for other fields of knowledge to have access to the knowledge we produce, because we are very close to the individual. Even if we consider this problem, the problems that we have with individualism, even that makes us closer to the living experience of people. So it's important for other fields of knowledge to have access to that. And we have tools, for example, for helping understand the priorities of people, what is more important in a population, and that would be very important to interact with, for example, political parties and etc. That's what I'm thinking from the top of my head. Yeah.
Obrigado. Yeah, that's a really nice point, and your point there, Gustavo, about accessibility. I mean, the animation is designed, and that's what the Impact Incubator is doing through EAWOP and through Glasgow, is designed to be accessible, and it certainly is.
I would like to echo what Jelena said about kind of the importance of relationships and connections, also for another reason, and that is that this is necessary to understand each other better. Like Mac said, well, it's so important to look at this from different disciplines, but also it's important to look at it from different standpoints. So, like, one thing that we found in our research is that refugees in a host country quite often don't just say under-regulate, do too little, but they misregulate. They use scripts and understanding set priorities they know from their home country, use strategies they know from their home country, which in the host country might appear terribly off and can lead to a lot of misunderstandings and people possibly looking lazy or appearing to be more demanding than they actually are, because they don't really understand how the system in the host country actually works. And really this having relationships and being part of a community becomes important to understand, on the one hand, where these people are coming from and helping them understand how the system truly works. And I think particularly the first half is important in the sense of, like, integration does not just mean assimilation. Like you come from some other place and you need to do everything exactly the same way we do it, but also that we understand a little bit where you are coming from. Another thing that I think is important is that we look at people whose safety is being threatened, or people in these difficult situations, and not just as so something is being done to them, but also see how in the situation they can be strengthened, their resilience can be strengthened. So what we saw is, like, different researchers have found this, like when people are down, when people are in a dismal situation, this actually is also when their own self-regulation starts to fail them, when they make less smart decisions than they used to make. And when it's just more difficult for them to do what is really needed. So essentially having in mind, it's particularly when people are down, they are not at their best game, but particularly in these situations, they need to be at their best game. So maybe one thing that we also need to start thinking about is like, how can we strengthen people's resilience? How can we help them remain closer to the top of their game, sort of, even when the going gets rough?
And unless anybody else has got something they really want to say, I think we can maybe start to close off there, but the animation is going to be available for use in the classroom and to enhance that idea of accessibility, and it is accessible, as we've said. Can we just go to the next panel, next slide there, Christine and Laura? Because I wanted to let you know, of course, that there is the conversation is starting here, it's not finishing, and there are further events planned as part of the tricentenary, and there is a small group meeting funded by EAWOP on precarious employment, which is coming up in September. And if you do click on that URL, you'll see the information about the meeting. It's open, I think it's still open, as to submissions and so on, and that's something that's coming around the corner quite soon. If anybody else hasn't got anything else they want to add, I think maybe we can finish the webinar at that point. Just thank everybody for participating and for sharing and for contributing. It's given me a huge amount of thought myself to take away. I'm sure everybody's in the same space. I'll maybe mention as well Project Safe that Veronica talked about early on, security assessment for everybody. There's a website for that, and if you click on that, you can have a look at the ways you might join that project as well. They're just two examples, and hopefully we'll continue the conversation a long time after this.